Sorry, thanks, Ferdia. Good morning, everyone, and a huge thanks also to Brian and Anya for the invitation. It's always a joy to come to the Burren, as I think all of you will probably agree. Brendan is always an incredibly hard act to follow, but also he's set up quite nicely, I think, lots of things I'm going to talk about today. So to start off, everything I'm talking about today is work not done directly by me. It was work that was done by Michelle Larkin, who finished her PhD in my lab a couple of years ago. I think some of you are probably familiar with Michelle because she's now the Pollinator Monitoring Officer with the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So all credit goes to Michelle. And I also have to say a huge thanks to Brendan and his team, and particularly Sharon, who really helped with the experimental setup of all of this work as well. Okay, so we've heard a lot between yesterday and today about the Burren and the invertebrates of the Burren, and I'm glad to hear that pollinators have been mentioned at various times yesterday. And I suppose, you know, the Burren is a biodiversity hotspot. 70% of our national flora is in the Burren, and a large proportion of that is within our semi-natural grasslands. And we know from the literature that where you get a high diversity of plants, particularly flowering plants, it's likely that you get a high diversity of pollinators as well. We heard from Jasmine yesterday about butterflies, we heard from Dave about moths, we heard from Tom about hoverflies, and I think they've all convinced you that the Burren is a hotspot for these groups. Bees weren't mentioned so much yesterday. I think Brian mentioned them a little bit, and so did Adam. But hopefully some things I will talk about today will cast a little bit more light on bees and bee diversity within the Burren. But the main pollinator groups that we focused on in this particular research were the bees, dividing them into the bumblebees and solitary bees. We also looked at hoverflies, and we also looked at butterflies. And Brendan, of course, has introduced already the Burren programme, how it works, and you're all aware that there's a huge diversity in terms of a huge range in the diversity of grasslands within the Burren. So we have everything from improved grasslands to really high quality, high diversity grasslands. And these are all accounted for within the Burren programme, and farmers, as Brendan introduced really nicely, receive different payments depending in part on the diversity of their grassland. Now there's lots of other things that they're paid on as well, but one of the key components of the scores that Brendan introduced so nicely is the conservation value of fields. So this field on the left has obviously been improved, very little diversity there, mainly lowly and perennial. This would receive a D in the conservation component of the Burren programme score, whereas the field on the right there, you can see lots of things. There's knapweed there, I can see oxeye daisy, there's a huge variety of plants there. That's more likely, well, Neil would know for sure, but that's more likely a B or an A within the Burren programme. So, you know, within results-based agri-environment schemes, obviously these kind of biodiversity value of fields needs to be scored, and the obvious way to do that is to use plants. Plants don't move, they're easy to survey, and we know a lot about plants and particularly indicator species for high-quality grasslands. But what we wanted to ask in Michelle's work is, okay, so these are the scores that are given to these fields for plants. How do they link then with pollinator diversity as well? But as you're all aware, insects, in particular pollinating insects, they're mobile. They don't just have a habitat in a particular field. They are influenced by the wider landscape as well. So we wanted to ask two questions. We wanted to ask, first of all, how does conservation value score within an agri-environment scheme affect pollination diversity? But we also wanted to ask, how does the composition of the surrounding landscape affect that as well? So Michelle, with the help of Sharon, selected 23 sites all around the Burren. These sites represented scores from A to D in terms of conservation values, so some had high plant diversity, some had low plant diversity, but half of these were within high intensity landscapes, so there was more than, within a 2-kilometre radius, there was more than 65% intensive grassland, and some of these were in what we called low intensity landscapes, where more than 65% of the surrounding 2-kilometre radius was low intensity management. Michelle, this was done back in 2017. She spent a huge amount of time driving around the Burren, sampling insects. She used sampling pollinators using two methods, pan traps and also transect walks. So some of you might have seen her wandering around fields for hours and hours searching for pollinators. She wasn't going to be finding much in that field anyway. Okay, so for an entomological audience, I thought you might have been interested just to see what the different sampling methods found. Interestingly, she found more species of all of the groups she looked at in transects than in pan-traps, pretty much across the board. So in transects, she found 11 species of bumblebees, whereas she only found 6 in pan-traps. Solitary bees is slightly the opposite trend, and I'll talk about solitary bees a little bit more, because what you'll see there, it's very striking that the numbers and the diversity of solitary bees is very, very low. Butterflies obviously are only sampled using transects, and hoverflies she found more in the transects than the pan-traps, although the pan-traps did yield 6 species that weren't found at all in the transects there. So these numbers are obviously lower than the total diversity of what was talked about yesterday in terms of butterflies and hoverflies and other groups in the Burren. But you have to remember Michelle was only sampling species-rich grasslands. She wasn't looking at the other habitat types. Okay, so what did she find? Well, these are her results for bumblebees. So on the left here, you can see bumblebee species richness, and on the bottom, you can see the conservation value within the Burren program. So what you can see is that you get more bumblebees, or a higher species richness of bumblebees, but it was similar for abundance and diversity in fields with high conservation value. And this was significant in particular when it comes to the D fields. So it seems that field scale agri-environmental management is beneficial for bumblebees. Interestingly, the landscape context, whether they were in high or low diversity landscapes, wasn't so important for bumblebees. Yes, there was a slightly higher richness in low intensity landscapes, but it wasn't actually significant. And this is probably due to the fact that bumblebees are mobile, they can fly over longer distances. So therefore, a 2-kilometer radius landscape probably mightn't be as influential for bumblebees. Hoverflies, interestingly, we found very different results. So for hoverflies, we found no differences between the conservation values in terms of hoverfly richness, and again, similar for diversity and abundance. But what was striking here is that we did find an effect of landscape context. So in low-intensity landscapes, we found significantly higher hoverfly species richness than in the high-intensity landscapes. And what we think might be going on here is exactly some of the things that were really highlighted yesterday, that lots of these groups need more than just the species-rich grasslands. They need a diversity of features within the landscape. So these low-intensity landscapes probably had areas of scrub, they might have had some wetland areas, so on and so forth, that are actually providing, for hoverflies in particular, maybe the larval habitats that they need, and so on and so forth. So it seems that the composition of the landscape is very important for hoverflies. Ashley, sorry, I've got some of these as well. But really, this is for butterflies. So this is butterfly community composition. So for butterflies, again, we didn't find any differences between our 4 conservation values in terms of butterfly community composition. But we did find differences in the communities of butterflies between the high and low intensity landscapes. And what we think is going on here is something similar to the hoverflies, that again, butterflies probably need a wider diversity of habitats within the landscape, which this landscape level analysis provides. And something that I think Jesmond mentioned yesterday that we thought as well from our results was that shelter actually, particularly in parts of the Burren, might be important for butterflies, given that some areas are particularly exposed. Okay, so that brings me on to solitary bees. We're really excited to look at solitary bees in the Burren because not a huge amount has been done on solitary bees in the Burren, or in general across parts of Ireland, certainly in more recent times. But interestingly, we only recorded 8 species of solitary bees in the Burren during the sampling period, and this is 10% of the Irish fauna. So in some work that I had done previously in the southeast of Ireland in intensively managed silage fields, in a similar number of sites using similar methods, I've actually found 9 species of solitary bees. So you would have expected that there would have been a much higher diversity of solitary bees here in the Burren. Now, this could be the fact that we only sampled twice, we're only sampling species-rich grasslands, maybe it was an unusual year, there's lots of reasons why that might be, but it might also be indicative of a broader trend here, that the Burren, perhaps it has high floral diversity, but maybe it is quite a harsh landscape to be a solitary bee. It is exposed, it can be wet in winter time, it can be wet any time of the year, who am I kidding? But we've talked about shelter for butterflies, maybe it's a harder landscape to be a solitary bee because of wind and so on and so forth. We don't know. Something else that could be going on, again, being quite a rocky landscape. A lot of our solitary bees are ground nesting species, so it might be harder to actually find nest sites within the burrow. So I think solitary bees in the Burren definitely deserve a lot more work. The one species we found a lot of was Lasioglossum calceatum. It's a least concerned species, the slender mining bee. There's one of Stephen Falk's lovely pictures of it there. So yeah, I think solitary bees we need to learn a lot more about within the Burren. So to summarize this piece of work, it seems that local and landscape management has implications for pollinators. So I think, so our results-based agri-environment schemes are doing a really good job at preserving our species-rich grassland habitat. But as we talked about yesterday, a diversity of habitat seems to be important, particularly for groups like butterflies and hoverflies. Bumblebees really like high floral diversity in these grasslands, so a field scale kind of management is working really well for bumblebees. Okay, so when you think about pollinators, you can think about their diversity, but it's also really important to think about the plants that they're actually foraging on. So not such an exciting combination here. This is a common Bombus pascor and uncommon Trifolia repens, but I'm proud of the photo, so I thought I'd put it up anyway. Okay, so another part of Michelle's work was that she actually looked at the interactions between pollinators and plants in her field sites. So this was part of the data she collected as she was walking her transect. So again, these are horrible diagrams, and I apologize for them, but they show us interesting things. So what we have on the top here is we have our pollinator species, and on the bottom we have plant species. And these are called plant pollinator networks, and the lines in between show the visits between the two. So this is for an A field, so high quality grassland, and this is for a D field, a low quality grassland. And it's really striking immediately that the relationships between plants and pollinators are so much more complicated in the A field than in the D field. So it shows that diversity is affecting the interactions between species as well. So Michelle was able to pull some interesting things out of these networks, and she was able to look at some of the key plants that were acting as important species for pollinators in these Burren grasslands. So the key plant that came out for bumblebees really was Centuria nigra, common knapweed. So probably no surprise to anyone who's looked at bumblebees. At this time of year, if you go to a patch of knapweed, you're going to find loads and loads of bumblebees. So all 9 species she looked at visited Centuria nigra, and 17% of all bumblebee visits were to this species. For solitary bees, it was different, not surprising. Again, she had very low numbers here. And for the botanists in the audience, I apologize. I take a little bit of liberty in my photographs because I didn't quite have photographs of the right pollinator group on the right plant, so they're close, but not exact. Anyway, for solitary bees, the 2 important plant species that came out were the rough hawkbit, Leontodon hispidus, and also then the meadow buttercup, Ranunculus acris. So the buttercup is an interesting one because lots of farmers don't particularly like buttercups, and I don't think it's rated very highly in the Burren program, but it can actually be a useful plant for certain pollinators, such as solitary bees in this case. For butterflies, it was interesting. One that came out was the autumn hawkbit, Leontodon autumnalis, so I'd be interested to hear what Jasmine has to say about that. Again, 14% of all butterfly visits were recorded to this species, and Centuria nigra came out again for butterflies. Again, both of these are late flowering species, so obviously from a conservation point of view, butterflies need resources earlier in the season as well, but still, it's interesting to see that these are some key drivers of the patterns that we saw in butterfly diversity. Hoverflies then finally were possibly the most interesting group because they just love buttercups. So Ranunculus repens in this case had the highest species strength when it came to hoverflies, so 25% of all hoverfly visits were to this species. So again, it's not something that's rated very highly in agricultural terms, but I think we have to be careful sometimes that although some of these plants mightn't be very interesting from a plant or conservation point of view, they can actually be providing resources for other organisms. And for hoverflies and solitary bees, you've got to remember these species don't have very long tongues. They find it hard to get into the nectar at certain plant species. So these more open plants can often be quite important for them. All right, so the final thing I want to mention in Michelle's work was something that was close to her heart and my heart by the end, and this is the shrill carder bee, Bombus silvarum. So I hope you've managed to see it over the last few days. If not, hopefully we'll see it today or tomorrow. It's a really lovely bumblebee, and it's one of our rarest bumblebees in Ireland. It's endangered on the Irish Red List, and really the stronghold of the species now is the Burren, and this is a stronghold not just within Ireland, but within Ireland and the UK. So the Burren is a very important site for this bee. So we don't know a huge amount about the bee in general, so Michelle just wanted to carry out some basic ecological research into this particular bee species here within the Burren. So she wanted to compare kind of the habitat requirements of the shrill carder with 3 of our more common bumblebee species. The top one there, Bombus pascorum, the common carder. The middle there, Bombus lucorum group, the white-tailed bees. And the bottom was Bombus lapidarius. Okay, so Michelle spent a lot of time surveying these bees, this time not just in grasslands, but in a range of different habitats. And this is what she found. So here we've got Bombus silvarum, and here we've got the other species. So what you'll see for the other species is each of the bars representing the different habitat types, they all have A's over them. So actually we didn't find significant differences in the abundance of the more common bee species between the different Burren habitats. So this is quite interesting because it shows they're using a wide range of different habitats within the Burren. However, Bombus silvarum, we found significantly more Bombus silvarum in calcareous grassland than hazel scrub, and not quite significant, but certainly more of it in calcareous grassland than some of the other habitat types. So it shows that this rarer species probably has quite a strong association with calcareous grasslands, which is probably the reason why the Burren is a stronghold for this particular species. This here just shows what Bombus silvarum was foraging on. So again, Centuria nigra comes out as really, really important for this species, and also Suxiza pratensis as well, also very important for this species. And again, these are 2 plants highly associated with species-rich grasslands. This just shows the phenology of Bombus silvarum, so how many were seen in different months. So in April, this kind of shows it's a late emerging species, wasn't seen in April. In May, we were seeing queens and workers in equal amounts. Then in June, July, mainly workers. In August, males start to appear. September, October, then you're getting queens. So it's a late emerging species, but what's interesting here as well is how late it actually does continue foraging into the season, kind of into the autumn. So you're still seeing it in September or October. So a lot of people kind of think about invertebrates, so at the end of August, kind of things are calming down, that's the end of things, but it's actually not. So in terms of thinking about management for some bumblebees in particular, it's important to consider management in that September and October period, especially when the new reproductives are being produced, because they then need to provision and build up their reserves to be able to hibernate over the winter. Okay, so to conclude, the Burren has lots of flowers, and unsurprisingly, therefore, is also a pollinator hotspot, certainly for hoverflies, butterflies, bumblebees. Solitary bees, the jury is still out, and I'd love to see some more work on solitary bees in the Burren for that region. Are they underrecorded or are they underrepresented? And I think we need to know more about that. Another key conclusions from this are a local field scale management is really beneficial for some groups, but for other groups we need to consider the field scale management, but also the landscape management. Some particular plant species are really key for these groups. Now, this isn't saying these groups are reliant on them by any means. They obviously need a diversity of plants within the landscape, but some in particular are heavy hitters. And for some of our rare bumblebees, particularly Bombus silvarum, I think we've provided some evidence for why the Burren might be a hotspot for this particular species. Now, I've taken the liberty of being a bit naughty and showing a picture of another bumblebee species there, because I think it's one that's of interest when it comes to the Burren. And this is the great yellow bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus. I hope some of you have seen it. It's a really beautiful bee, but the chances are many of you haven't, unless you've been to Belmullet and the Mullet Peninsula, which is the last remaining stronghold of this bumblebee. But what's interesting is that the type of plants it forages on and the type of grasslands it likes are very, very well represented here in the Burren. So it's a bit of a mystery why this species is now only found in the Mullet and is no longer found in the Burren. It was here previously until about 10 years ago, and there's been 1 or 2 sporadic records, but we're not quite sure if there is any. I would be very surprised if there's any remaining populations here in the Burren. But it's certainly worth looking out for. I don't know what's going on with the species. I have a feeling it could be something maybe to do with disease, potentially with competition with honeybees. There's lots of things to figure out here, but it's a bit of a mystery why it's not here in the Burren anymore, because it really seems like the ideal habitat for it. So my message to you is keep your eyes peeled. If you do see it, take a photo. It would be really nice to find an active population of it here. Okay, so finally, I'd really like to thank Sharon in particular and all at the Burren programme for facilitating this work. And it's fantastic to work with such a dynamic and great programme. Huge thanks to the 23 farmers that allowed us to work on their farms. And they were also really interested in what Michelle was doing and what we found. And also thanks to our funders and to a few field assistants who helped us out as well. And a huge thanks to all of you for listening.
Great, Dara, perfect timing. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah, at the back.
Thanks, Dara. Thanks for the mic.
Sorry, yeah.
Thanks for the nice presentation and for presenting Michelle's work. I'm just curious, one of the points you made at the end regarding honeybees. I keep 2 beehives in the Burren as a beekeeper, a hobbyist beekeeper, and often I worry. It's a very managed species. We give it a house, we give it supplementary feed, we give it medicine when it needs it, and it's an incredibly large colony and a very effective pollinator and competitive as well. So I'm wondering, was there any observations that Michelle might have done regarding honeybee preference of certain fields or flowers, and maybe otherwise you'd have a comment maybe why the solitary bee is also underrepresented. Is there a competition there that might be at play? And maybe, as Ashley said earlier, should we be eating roast beef for Sunday roast? Maybe should we be having honey at all to round it off? But yeah.
That's a really interesting question and a really complex one, and one I don't think, unfortunately, we have the answer to. So obviously honeybees are largely in Ireland a managed species. We do have some evidence now from work in NUI Galway that we do have some feral colonies, at least, of honeybees. But the vast majority are managed by us as beekeepers. So they are a managed species that we then put out into the landscape. Some evidence suggests from some countries that where you have really, really high densities of honeybees, you can have behavioural changes in wild pollinators. There isn't a huge amount of evidence yet that it actually affects their populations per se. That's just a lack of studies. They're really hard studies to do and to do well. But it perhaps wouldn't be surprising where there are high densities, if there's high densities of honeybees and low densities of flowers, that there may be competition for sure. We need to know more, basically. Something we do know as well about, and that's what I was alluding to there, is we do know that there can be disease transfer between honeybees and wild pollinators, particularly bumblebees. And there's quite convincing evidence from the UK that that's been the case. So you get higher disease prevalence of diseases that you get in honeybees in bumblebees, where you have high density of honeybee colonies. So honeybees could be a vehicle for introducing disease to new areas potentially. But to be honest, we just don't know. And obviously beekeeping is really important. Honeybees provide really important pollination services to crops and also to some of our wild plants. And they are native to Ireland. Honeybees were originally here. We had wild populations before disease probably became such an issue that now most of our populations are managed. So it's different in other parts of the world where honeybees are not native as well. So it's a really complex issue. I think beekeeping is important. Obviously, wild pollinator conservation is important as well. And we just need to know more about the potential competitive interactions. So sorry, inconclusive. Yeah.
If you wanted to see a feral honeybee population, there's a window there. You can see them. And if anybody wants to give any advice to Tim, about how to remove, because they're in this electrical. They've been there about a year apparently. Okay. But you can see them out the back of the gate. I don't advise you to go through the gate. They're definitely a feral honeybee population. I just want to say thanks so much, Dara. That was a brilliant talk. Just one comment: did Michelle look at the species composition in terms of like Ashley did with the gills? Because not all hoverflies, for example, are equal, and there may be aphid feeders or there may be plant miners, etc. Did she look at that?
No, we didn't look at functional traits. It was just an extra step beyond what we had. We do have the data, if anyone would like to do that. We did look at community composition, all right, but no, we didn't go to the kind of functional guild level. But yeah, for sure, it would be interesting. Be interesting even for butterflies and for bumblebees as well, because yeah, it could be that certain traits that the species have are driving their occurrence. And you'd expect that because, because we only looked at species-rich grasslands, there's likely some species that are going to benefit from those habitats more than others, for sure. Yeah.